Story 1. I'm a professional baker and have worked for various companies developing recipes and the like. I found a job at a local grocery store, working super early mornings on their pastries for the day. There were usually a few other people there, one of whom was a mixer. Mixers typically follow a spec sheet with the weights of all the ingredients they need to batch mix. It's kind of mindless work and doesn't require much thought. He was a young guy, fresh out of his teens. We became fast coworker friends and enjoyed chatting it up about baking, and I'd help him put our supply order away. Good times. One day, a woman with a thick Russian accent came in and handed us business cards. She told us whatever we're getting paid, her company would double it if we came to work for them. I scheduled an interview, thinking this would be a great opportunity for me. It was a new grocery store concept, like a glitzy glammy European-style Costco, whatever that means. When I went in for the interview, the place was literally still under construction. I met their lead baker, and we hit it off right away. He warned me that the big boss had interesting tastes, and we'd need to work with that. No biggie. More money. Let's go. They hired us both, and over the next several months, it was a really interesting and fun experience. The big boss, thick, burly Russian man, to the point and perpetually angry, wanted this place to be like Costco, mass production of quality pastries. They were bringing in crazy amounts of new equipment, including folders, shapers, and injectors that were easily worth millions. We didn't have much equipment to start, and we were doing a lot of mixing in trash cans. Remember my mixer buddy? Well, he was working on the bread dough, using spec sheets provided by our lead baker. Over time, they were bringing on more staff, and it was a lot of fun developing new recipes, experimenting with ratios, and figuring out how to get over constraints for the types of products that boss wanted. Did I mention he was a jerk? Oh yeah. When he was reviewing some cheesecake I had made, he said, "Good job, sweetie." I came back with, "Miss, ma'am, or my name is fine." He scowled at me, and from that point on he treated me like garbage. We brought other women on staff. I watched him hit on them. Some of the others were cool with being sexually harassed, I guess. This place was paying top dollar and had to get in good with the big boss, right? So, the stage is set here. Boss quickly turned his business into a game of survivor. He'd fire people on the spot for whatever reason. One day, one of the people he sacked was our lead baker. It came as a surprise since he was developing all the recipes we'd be using. I inherited a lot of his notes, and his development work was divided between me and the mixer. So, this whole time Mixer was sucking up to Big Boss pretty hard. He was seeing an open position with the lead baker gone, and quickly became invested in the idea of him running the bakery show and making some serious money. At the same time, my relationship with Big Boss was quickly declining. For example, I had him sample some cinnamon rolls I had made, and he came back with, "I hate these, they're terrible." What do you not like? We can change anything about them. The dough? The filling? The icing? I don't know, I just don't like them. On a hunch, I gave some cinnamon rolls from the same batch to another lady there he had eyes for, and asked her if she'd present them to him as her own. She offered him the same product I had given him minutes before, and he loved it. You huh? Anyway, I noticed that my notes were out of place one day, and a coworker informed me my mixer buddy was stealing my work and presenting it as his own. He was also approaching me and asking a lot of baking questions, which was fine, but I knew that his knowledge of industrial ratio baking was mediocre at best. He was a mixer. Following a recipe is all he knew how to do. Knowing this, I made a decoy copy of my notes, but this time I put really awful recipes with huge amounts of salt or yeast. Anyone who knew how to build a recipe could probably look at it and go, "Whoa, that's a lot." Not Mixer Buddy. My original plan was to leave this in an obvious spot as bait and let him steal the awful recipes, but Big Boss had other plans. We sat down for a pre-launch meeting, and he informed me I wasn't going to be working in the bakery anymore and being relegated to store setup. Mixer was going to be taking over as the lead baker. Guess all that sucking up really paid off, and I was to give him all my notes so far. No problem, boss. A day later was when the fun really began. Mixer mixed up a huge batch of super salty cake batter, and I heard Big Boss screaming at him about way too much salt. That's not even where the fun begins. As we were setting up industrial quantity baking equipment, we had to test the larger quantity mixing machines, and did a test run for some bread dough, with my decoy recipe that had triple the yeast and sugar. As it didn't come out right, Mixer had to throw it away. His choice: the dumpster out back in the dead heat of summer. Hundreds of pounds of dough. The fun thing about massive amounts of bread dough is that it doesn't magically stop rising if you throw it away, especially in a hot dumpster. A few hours later, I spied out back to see Mixer Buddy shoveling this massive blob of dough into trash bags that had exploded from the dumpster, like an uncovered blender spewing out a yeast-laden smoothie. Sweet revenge. Now, about the mafia thing. This store was really strange. They had been ordering doubles of all the crazy industrial baking equipment and storing them in the back. We had nowhere to put any of this. I also looked up the company they were subcontracted under, and it was to a dead address in Russia. Big Boss also had armed security guards everywhere. This was a grocery store, mind you. I had a feeling that this company was more of a front for laundering a bunch of money. I eventually was fired by Big Boss, which was great because I had been job hunting, full well knowing this business was a sinking ship. I had a new job lined up already. They had their grand opening, did business for 3 months, then closed. Rest in peace, Mixer. Story 2. This story isn't about me, but rather about a sharp and incredibly witty union representative I once had the pleasure of working with. Let's call him Jeff. When I was in my late 20s, I worked as a supervisor at a large theme park, specifically overseeing one of the roller coasters. Safety protocols were an integral part of our job, drilled into us weekly so that we could instinctively follow proper procedures in any emergency. Fire drills, ride evacuations, and medical scenarios were regularly reviewed and tested. Everyone, regardless of their role, was expected to know these protocols inside and out. A wrong answer during a safety quiz could result in serious consequences. One day, I was working alongside Jeff, a fellow supervisor with over a decade of experience. Jeff wasn't just a seasoned supervisor, he also held a union position, which gave him an edge when dealing with management. While Jeff was beloved by employees and peers alike, he had a reputation for clashing with upper management. He was clever, sharp-tongued, and certainly not someone to cross. That particular day, the fire alarm went off at our roller coaster. The protocol for such situations was clear. Stop loading new customers onto the ride. Evacuate all customers from the building simultaneously. Run the ride to unload any customers already on it. Once all customers were off the ride, stop the ride and evacuate employees. This process ensured that everyone, customers and employees alike, could exit the building as quickly and safely as possible. However, that day, a young, ambitious manager trying to prove themselves arrived during the evacuation. Instead of following standard procedure, the manager made the decision to stop loading and evacuate customers, but not to stop the ride for employees to leave. This meant both employees and customers were stuck in the building for an additional 20 minutes, far longer than necessary. Jeff was visibly furious, but followed the manager's orders. When the last customer had finally left the building, the manager, clearly pleased with their handling of the situation, smugly turned to Jeff and announced, "Now you can follow protocol." Jeff raised his eyebrows and, without missing a beat, responded, "Oh, now I can? All right." What happened next was a masterclass in malicious compliance. Jeff waited for just the right moment before slamming the emergency stop button. The timing was no accident. He allowed each vehicle on the coaster to crest its respective lift and engage its safety brakes. These safety brakes were designed to stop the vehicles in emergencies, but resetting them required maintenance staff to physically winch each one out and back to a lift, a laborious and time-consuming process. With vehicles locked in every safety brake zone, Jeff turned to the manager and said, "Have fun with that. I'm going home." Oh, and I'll be filing a grievance with the union for endangering employee lives. The fallout was immediate. The ride, which should have been down for just an hour, ended up being out of commission for 6. When maintenance arrived and saw the state of the ride, they were understandably furious. Jeff, however, faced no consequences. In fact, he left the area not long after this incident. The manager, surprisingly, also escaped repercussions and reportedly went on to have a successful career. But for the rest of my time at that theme park, I loved retelling the story of Jeff's wide-eyed smirk as he asked, "Oh, now I can?" and turned a 1-hour downtime into a 6-hour ordeal. It was a brilliant display of calculated compliance and a reminder not to underestimate those who know the rules better than anyone else. Story 3. I got to see this one a few days ago at a motel I spent a couple days at, while my truck got fixed while on a road trip. It was a little place in a small town, part of a budget chain. The room was cheap, clean, and several restaurants were within walking distance. The staff was all locals, and it had a small staff. A couple desk clerks, a handful of young housekeepers, and 2 guys who did maintenance and grounds work, keeping the place up. I've worked all of my life, so I got out of my way to be nice to other working folks. My housekeeper maid was a pretty young thing in her early 20s, I'll call Jenny. She was a sweet kid who did her job and impressed me by how efficiently she did her job, and was very nice when I asked about extra towels. The problem came in the form of a group of young women who were flight attendant trainees. There was a company down the road that ordered a block of rooms for these young women who were training to be flight attendants. I think the training school was a scam. I've never heard of an airline who didn't interview and hire their own flight attendants. This was a small motel in a smaller town, but I got to know and dislike these young women quickly, as did the rest of the motel staff and several nearby businesses. These young women came in with an attitude that amazed me. They were loud, rude, and nasty to everyone from the front desk to housekeeping to other guests. They complained about everything from the lack of a bar to the number of TV channels. Anyone who so much as looked in their direction was hitting on them. But the point of this tale is when the flight attendant trainee in the room next to mine started raising hell about the room being filthy. I was outside my room on the landing overlooking the parking lot when the door flies open and the girl storms out. I turned around when the door banged against the wall and could see that the room was trashed. The housekeeper was making her way towards our rooms with her cart to vacuum. This trainee is wearing designer jeans and a tank top and starts screaming at the housekeeper that she'd better get in her room and clean it properly or else. She goes on to scream that there have been soda bottles and fast food trash in the room for a week. The housekeepers in this place wear jeans and tanks in the summer and have a light smock with the motel's name, their name and housekeeping on it. The entitled trainee almost exploded when the housekeeper got there with her cart, looked into the room, and politely informed the girl that the hotel's policy was that housekeeping was not allowed to remove anything from a guest room that was not in the trash can. She told her that they are not allowed to assume that anything in the room was trash. I thought the trainee was going to explode. She instantly started with the "when I get done with your manager, you'll be looking for a new job, you lazy witch." She stormed off to the office and came back even madder after I assumed being told that the policy was exactly what the housekeeper had told her. But when the trainee came back, she was determined to have a confrontation. By this time Jenny was vacuuming my carpet and had already emptied my trash can. I stood outside while she worked, as this was a safety policy to protect the maids from male guests who might have good intentions. The housekeeper made up the bed and cleaned the bathroom, and I was told it was done. I thanked her and started to step inside my room when Jenny went next door to do the trainee's room. The minute she stepped inside the door, I heard the sound of glass breaking, and I backed out the door to see what was happening. The trainee was standing in the middle of the room, picking up glass soda bottles from the furniture and dropping them on the floor to break against the ones she already had dropped, while demanding that Jenny get down on her hands and knees and clean up the broken glass. When the pretty blonde smiled and told her that she wasn't allowed to touch anything that wasn't in the trash basket, the trainee lost her mind and stormed towards the housekeeper and threw a punch. Jenny was shocked, but fortunately, she was agile and ducked under the second attempted punch, and the entitled trainee slammed her fist into a steel motel room door and managed to hurt her wrist and hand. The trainee went to the office screaming that the housekeeper had assaulted her, and returned with the manager, who was also the owner, and demanded Jenny to be fired. The manager asked what happened, and the trainee screamed that she'd been assaulted. Jenny told her side, and I introduced myself and told the manager that I was standing on the deck outside the rooms and saw what happened when I heard glass breaking. I explained that the girl punched Jenny and hurt herself by throwing a second punch. That was all it took. He immediately asked for the police to be called. The girl was furious and went on about suing them and the chain they were part of. When I checked out later that day, I'd left Jenny a nice tip in my room, and I asked the manager what happened to the flight attendant trainee. It seems she sprained her wrist and broke 2 bones in her hand. She told the police her side of the story, and they told her that punching a steel door is not the motel's fault, and that she already was the one who actually punched the staff. They ended up pressing charges against her for assault. The manager also found out that the flight attendant training school was shut down for not having the proper certifications to offer job training in that state. Can't figure out why people can't treat others with respect instead of threats and demands. Story 4. Neither me nor the family involved in this story supports any kind of violence here. This happened about a month ago. I went to look for some Christmas gifts with my sister and her children, both 6 and 8 years old, respectively. She had actually planned to buy them a Nintendo Switch after saving up enough money. We walked into that specific game store where we would get the console, alongside Mario Maker 2. Everything has been going fine with the purchase, and we were just about to make it, until my sister left her purse in the car. She had to quickly leave while asking me to look after my nephews, while also telling the clerk to wait until she came back. Sure enough, I stayed with the kids and waited. Then a mildly fat woman appeared out of the blue, and she tried to buy the same Nintendo Switch we had already claimed. I then stepped in and went like, "Excuse me, ma'am, that's my Nintendo Switch. We're gonna buy it right this second." At the same time, the clerk already sided with me on this one. Immediately after stepping in, this entitled woman wasn't having it. "Nonsense," she said. "This is how the rest of the convo went. You have more than one of these in your storage, right?" "Sorry, ma'am, this is the last one, and he claimed it first." "Shut up." This entitled woman was looking at us in disgust, as if she smelled rotten food, then looked back at the clerk. "Why are you going the trouble of waiting for these wetbacks to pay with money they don't even have?" My nephews began to feel uncomfortable and sad as they were having their perfect Christmas gift taken away by some evil jerk. One of them actually firmly clung to it, never to let go. The entitled woman then pushed him back against a line of new games, which fell on him. This is when madness began. At the same time that woman pushed one of my nephews, my sister came back, absolutely irate. The woman got on her face and looked her dead in the eye. "You're not worth my time, you bunch of beaners." "Screw you," she says, before spitting my sister in the face. My sister, a former Muay Thai practitioner, did what a mother could ever do to protect her children. She kicked the entitled jerk in the face, knocking her out flat. The cops showed up shortly after. I couldn't remember much of what else happened, as I went ahead and immediately helped my hurt nephew as soon as the batch of games fell on him. However, this morning, I talked with my sister about this situation. Now that she was already clear, she tells me that the entitled woman is now facing charges of behaving under the influence, correct me if I got the wrong terms, destruction of private property, and assaulting a minor. While my sister was also facing any charges, these were dropped after reviewing CCTV and our statements. And yes, I returned the next day and bought the Nintendo Switch after they restocked, because that entitled woman broke the previous one anyhow when assaulting my nephew. We may consider therapy after Christmas and nigh, because my poor nephew is still distraught a month after the dispute. Update on my assaulted nephew. Much appreciated for your comments suggesting I should look for a therapist. Right now, I've been looking for a therapist to treat my nephew as soon as the entire Christmas and night was over. My sister was the one successful in finding one, as her husband referred her to a friend of his, who happens to be a therapist. I mentioned before that there were 2 boys, 6 and 8-year-old, and the latter was the one assaulted by that lady. He is about to start his therapy sessions this week. Until then, I've been spending my time with my nephew. He seemed to be doing better, but he was still a bit distraught at what happened. I actually bought him the Mario 3D trilogy as a present, because he likes to play Super Mario a whole lot. It goes without saying that we didn't do anything on the matter at the time because we were busy with the December party stuff and the gifts to the rest of the family. On the fat Karen. I mentioned before that my sister was about to face charges for battery, but everything was dropped when that Karen was exposed on CCTV. I didn't have a deeper convo with my sis, but 2 months later, she told me in detail that the woman actually had crime records related to her violent and racist behavior. She was even arrested on possession of some illegal substance before. That woman will sit there for a long time, to keep it short. And on my sister. I'm sorry if I omitted some details about my sister. There was a time in her life where she suffered from anger management. She had enrolled in Muay Thai lessons to help control her rage. But seeing her thrashing that Karen was the very first time I saw her pissed off, and the greatest fit of rage I've seen ever. In addition to my nephew, she is also undertaking therapy to address this incident. Much appreciated for your time reading the whole story from the start. Story 5. About half a century ago, I spent some time in the Air Force, and like everyone else, I endured the misery of basic training. One of the infamous rites of passage for cadets was kitchen patrol, or KP for short. This involved spending an entire day doing menial and unpleasant tasks in one of the base chow halls. My turn inevitably came, but with an unexpected twist. Initially, it wasn't so bad. Between the casual Vietnam-era chatter and joking around with my fellow KP victims, it actually felt like a refreshing break from the strict routines of basic training. Naturally, this didn't sit well with the sergeant in charge. Every time he saw me enjoying myself, he'd assign me harder tasks or separate me from my friends. Eventually, he sent me to the dreaded pots and pans station, which, in the scorching Texas summer heat, meant scrubbing greasy cookware with hot water and brushes until sweat soaked through my heavy cotton fatigues. Still, I found ways to have fun. Sometimes, that's the only way to survive. But the sergeant wasn't done with me. Suddenly, his booming voice cut through the noise. "Roberts, get over here. I've got a job for you." "Yes, sir," I answered, stepping away from the pots. He opened the door to a small oven that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The inside was coated with burnt, blackened spills, hardened into a crust. He barked, "Clean this oven. I want it to shine like that table." He jabbed a finger at a stainless steel work table nearby and handed me a bucket containing a pumice scrubbing block. I got to work, but it didn't take long for me to notice that the abrasive block was scratching the enamel coating on the oven door. Concerned, I called out, "Sir, are you sure you want it to shine like the stainless table? This enamel is—" Before I could finish, he cut me off. "How many times do I have to tell you, Roberts? Are you deaf? Just shut up and do the damn job. You hippies make me sick." He stormed off, leaving me to my task. Taking him at his word, I continued scrubbing. Bit by bit, the enamel wore away, exposing bare steel underneath. I even worked around the edges of the door, trying to make it look as shiny as the sergeant had demanded. It was exhausting, and my muscles ached as I moved on to the interior. That's when the civilian chef, who managed the kitchen, walked in and spotted me. Her voice cut through the kitchen noise like a razor. "Honey, what in the world are you doing to my oven?" The room fell silent. In the background, you could faintly hear the bubbling of a pot and murmurs from the dining hall. Doing my best to sound clueless, I replied, "Well, ma'am, the sergeant over there told me to clean it and make it look like that table." I pointed to the stainless work surface. Her face turned crimson. "I am going to kill him." A moment later, she was towering over the sergeant, who was visibly shrinking under her fury. All I could catch from their conversation were snippets of, "Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry, ma'am. I understand, ma'am." He avoided looking at me as he retreated from her wrath, but the glare he shot in my direction was unmistakable. I'll admit, I felt bad about the damage to the oven. It probably never worked the same again. But watching that sergeant squirm under the chef's verbal assault, that was absolutely worth it. Story 6. So, for context, I work for a local tow truck company as the manager, and the roads outside our city up the hills are famous for being tricky and full of deadly turns to drive on. We are a busy company, especially during heavy rain periods where the roads are almost impossible to ride with cargo trucks. The owner of the company is a sweet old lady, and she does her best to help the truck drivers have the best time possible during this situation. We let them buy coffee and snacks in the stops on us, and they are very grateful for it. The costs are honestly not too high, especially because our contracts are quite hefty due said roads plus the many other regular people who don't know better how drive there. Every week, I go to the local truck stops to confirm how much we have to pay them all. I could do that by just a couple phone calls or messages. But if I have a chance to leave that office, I'll take it in a heartbeat. The workloads can be downright cruel sometimes, so that's a good break for me, and the owner doesn't mind at all. I'm known there to be the person who pays for the truckers' coffee and food, and while I always say that's the company paying for it, they are very grateful anyway, plus we treat them with dignity and respect they deserve, so that's another big plus. There was a day last year in the middle of summer, a big storm going on that swamped me with work. I had to help our 22 drivers to locate and retrieve people's cars, constantly receiving calls for help so much so the dread noise still hammer my head to this day. I had an assistant, but even so it was way too much for only 2 people to handle. We spend from 5 a.m. to 5 a.m. breaking our backs and minds that day. The road is even worse, so we had to work overnight. Then at 5 a.m., I was leaving home to rest, and the owner said she could cover the weekly visit to the stops. I thanked her but told to not care about one stop in particular because it was on my way home. Our office is located some miles off our city. Once I arrived at my regular stop to get a most-earned mountain of food and so much coffee it could thicken my blood. I was met by all the regulars, talked with everyone about the crazy storm and chit-chatted while my order was being done. It arrived and I was feasting on it. Then I hear a loud man yelling something in the lines of, "What do you mean you can't help me? This is your job," to the cashier. I look back and tell myself, what a crazy jerk. It was Roger, fake name. He keeps screaming with the cashier about something with the tires of his car, so I blocked the noise of my mind to finally eat my sustenance deed for an entire family. Then I hear a sharp and annoyed, "Hey you," coming from behind me. I thought I was in the way of someone to catch one of the condiments close me. So I say, "My bad." Push the basket with them aside and keep eating. Then I hear a loud stomp and someone Roger pulling me by my shoulder yelling at me, "Fire that awful employee immediately." I was still using my officer badge and clothes, so it is understandable Roger confused me with the manager, but I was just about over one of the most stressful days of my life and eating is sacred for me. So I simply release from his grip, turning back to my food, saying, "Go screw yourself." I could hear the cashier giggling, and the owner, Bob, fake name, who happens to be behind the counter getting people's orders, giving a good loud laugh, then promptly telling I'm just a customer and he's the one who runs business. "Roger, is that how you run your business then? Letting rude lousy cashiers treat your costumes as garbage and your other costumes harass me without consequences?" Bob looks at me and says, "I'm terribly sorry you have to go through this op. I'll see the bad customer out." Roger gives the biggest gasp I ever saw. "How dare you? You let your staff and customers harass good people like this? I'm calling the police, and by the looks of your disgusting food, I bet your kitchen is dirty with rats and cockroaches. I'm calling health surveillance too." I took great offense with this. I told him this food was 1,000 times better than whatever his wife does to him. Roger went into a bursting rage, threatening to get physical with me and yelling some very ruder words to me. But something Roger didn't realize is the restaurant was also full of truckers who were watching their friends being harassed. Some got up to defend us, and while we were in the middle of the confusion, I hear a rough, "Hey jerk, get the hell out of here." And when I look back, there was these three angry guys, each one with mechanical tools on their hands, and one with a fire axe looking like they are ready to kill. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze in place with the sight of the axe, and that seems to have convinced Roger too, because he started walking quite hastily outside yelling about calling the police. The truckers were behind him telling they would chop his limbs off if he ever comes back. Everything eventually went back to normal, and Bob even let me get that meal for free for all that trouble. Thank you, Bob. The police arrived later. We explained everything that happened. They asked if Bob wanted to press charges, and he simply said yes. If I can get anything from this is, have the right friends everyone, and be kind with truckers. They're a crazy bunch. Story 7. This story belongs to my father, not me. A few years ago, my father and his friend were enrolled in a professional course that required them to adhere to strict corporate standards. To provide some context, both of them already had stable, well-paying jobs and were taking the course purely to enhance their knowledge, not for career advancement or financial gain. The course was divided into multiple phases, and the one in question lasted 18 days. The rules stated that participants were allowed only one leave during the phase. If anyone missed more than that, they would have to retake the entire phase. The course was held 2 hours away from our city, so my father and his friend commuted daily to attend. Despite the long commute, they always aimed to arrive early. However, on one particular day, traffic in the city was unusually heavy, and they ended up running late. When they finally reached the course location at around 10:15 a.m., just 10 to 15 minutes late, they were informed by the course supervisor that they would be marked absent for half the day. Frustrated, they explained the reason for their lateness and pointed out that the lecture had not yet started. However, their arguments were dismissed. Adding to their frustration, the lecturer himself was also delayed by the same traffic and didn't begin the class until well after 11 a.m. Despite this, the half-day absence remained on record, leaving my father and his friend annoyed by the rigid enforcement of the rules. Later that day, at exactly 5 p.m., while the lecture was still ongoing, my father and his friend stood up, packed their bags, and began to leave the class. The lecturer looked confused, and the course supervisor was furious. He demanded to know what they were doing. They calmly replied, "We're following the protocol. If we are expected to arrive precisely at 10 a.m., we should also be able to leave at 5 p.m. The course supervisor, unprepared for such strict adherence to his own rules, began shouting, threatening to mark them absent for the full day, and even suggesting they could be removed from the course. Undeterred, they simply left. The next day, they arrived exactly at 10 a.m., ignored the course supervisor and his warnings, and left promptly at 5 p.m. again. Their actions inspired other participants to follow suit, and soon most of the class began leaving at 5 p.m., regardless of whether the lectures had ended. This unexpected turn of events forced the institute to pay the lecturers extra to return the following day to finish their sessions. In the end, my father and his friend completed the course without further issues, passing with flying colors. This story, though small, resurfaced in conversation a few days ago, and I couldn't resist sharing it here as a perfect example of malicious compliance.